Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. So, first of all, let me just say thank you and welcome to coming to the Smart Museum this afternoon. We are going to have an incredible gallery discussion. For those of you that may not know, my name is Dorian H. Nash. I am the project coordinator here at the Smart Museum, and I work as I work as a project coordinator. I've been doing so for almost the past 2 years. I know oftentimes when we have these types of discussions, you're used to seeing our esteemed Deputy Director, Mr. Michael Cristiano, who happens to be right there. Feel free to clap if you want to. But I have the great privilege and honor to moderate this afternoon's discussion. So I want to make sure that I don't forget anyone. So I have some cards here because, as I mentioned before, we will be having a discussion with 3 collectors and 3 artists. And before I even begin to try to introduce everyone, if I took the time to announce all of their accolades and all of their accomplishments, the hour would expire. So please know that sitting before you, we have quite a collective of accomplished artists and collectors that have been doing so for quite some time, that have added to the diaspora and to our culture as well, to our American and African American culture. So without further ado, I'm going to take a seat. So, as I mentioned before, we're going to have a discussion with kind of hopefully a very organic conversation with each collector and each artist. So to begin, I want to say a quote, if you don't mind, and that is, art is not a luxury, as many people think. It is a necessity. It documents history, it helps educate people and knowledge for generations to come. That is written by Dr. Samela Lewis, who is considered to be the godmother of African American art, and I think it's appropriate that as we have this discussion beginning about abstract art, that quote is appropriate. So again, without further ado, to the furthest end, the artist is Felicia Grant Preston. She is a visual artist and retired art educator. She received her BA from SIU, her MSED from Northern Illinois University, her MA at Chicago State University. Her work is included in the Paul R. Jones collection at the University of Delaware. Ms. Reed's publication in 2005 in the University of Delaware, date book for abstract and all that. And I'm sorry, I can't read my own writing. But yes, so please welcome Ms. Felicia. Sitting next to her is Ms. Pearlie Taylor. Ms. Taylor describes herself as an abstract expressionist artist. Her influences range from Jackson Pollock to Edward Dempsey. She studied by studying their approach to art, it made her her ability to create non-representational expression. An artist for over 30 years, primarily in acrylics, but uses a variety of mediums. She studied at the American Academy of Art, the Southside Community Arts Center right here in our own backyard. She has done solo exhibitions at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She was the 2007 National Black Fine Arts. She received the award for the National Black Fine Arts in New York. Her works are collected around the country and exhibited internationally. In 2005, she received the African American Alliance of the Arts for Excellence in Abstract Arts. Please welcome Ms. Pearlie Taylor. The next gentleman, which I know most of you are familiar with, is Mr. D.E. Simmons. He is the Executive Director of Diaspora Rhythms. He defines his collection as figurative imagery providing strong influences of our time. Mr. Simmons began collecting to provide a perspective of his place in the world and at home due to the lack of his people's visibility in day-to-day media and American culture. Please welcome Mr. D.E. Simmons. I might add that we are waiting for one other panelist, and if he shows and is able to still come, we'll add him, and I'll certainly introduce him at the appropriate time. The next on our list is Mr. G.L. Smothers. He began painting as a private pastime at Kent State University. His career began in interior design, and all the while he continued to paint privately. But 1994 marks the year that he decided to pursue art full-time. Over the past 25 years, he has exhibited his work in local and national venues, at the Museum of Science and Industry, the University of Illinois, African American Cultural Center, Jordan Evans Institute. Please welcome Mr. G.L. Smothers. And last but certainly not least, we have with us Ms. Gail E. Spann, who is an art collector. Ms. Spann has always been attracted to color, and she says, as she graduated from college, she went from collecting posters. I know I collected my fair share. She started collecting prints of masterworks, mostly landscapes at the time, but then progressively collecting photography to now where she collects figurative works. She describes her collection as eclectic. Please welcome Ms. Gail E. Spann. So as I mentioned before, this is going to be, we're in for quite a treat because we're going to have this discussion, hopefully with giving the opportunity for people to point out their works as well as kind of talk amongst ourselves. We're going to have a conversation that happens to be in front of all of you. So is that all right? Yeah. I don't mind auditory responses. That is just fine. So to begin, I'd like to ask Ms. Preston the first question. How do you know when a work is finished?
For me, working non-representationally is always very intuitive. Even there's a method that I use to work, but sometimes when things come and I get something that I feel like comes through, because I feel like I'm just a vessel by which this energy works through. I may pause and do something a little bit different because I've gotten some more information, but it is all intuitive. I know just by the way I feel that it's complete.
Thank you. Would any of the other artists be able to answer that? How do they know when a work is finished?
Well, I work intuitively like Felicia does, except that I don't use brushes in my work. So I have done pieces where only 2 strokes can be used on that in the painting. So even though there's 2 strokes, it may take me 2 hours to do that piece because it can't be dabbled with after it's done. So I have to know that whatever I do at that moment is going to complete that painting. So the first stroke is usually easy, but that second stroke may take an hour or more because I have to approach it from different angles. And I work with a lot of different objects, almost anything other than a brush. So it's kind of limited in terms of how much I can do. So after I know I use that limited approach until I have to be done anyway. I just have to stop.
Thank you. I would ask as each one shares their answers, please pull the mic as close as possible so that everyone has an opportunity to hear you. Mr. Smothers, did you have something you wanted to share?
Sure. I believe that, now I come from a sort of design background, so I approach paintings like a project. Unlike the two of you, my pieces are well thought out ahead of time, planned, work very disciplined. And I guess it's a skill set, sort of knowing when to stop, particularly with abstract work. And yeah, so that's, my pieces are well planned.
Okay, all right. So as we continue, so I would like to pose this question before some of our collectors, and please feel free, anyone can answer. So that question would be, I'm sorry, I got too many notes here, y'all. What advice would you give to people just starting their collection? No pressure.
It's hard to say what advice I would give them. I think my approach was just to buy what you like.
Yeah.
I mean, that's as simple as it gets. Whatever attracts you, be it figurative or abstract, color, black and white, because everybody's taste is different. That's a hard question. I don't know if anybody else has any different advice.
I do.
Of course.
I think one of the benefits of our organization, Diaspora Rhythms, is that we learn from each other as collectors. And our philosophy has been to buy what you like. The works will speak to you because of the energy that the artists have put into their creation. And so when we say buy what you like, we've all had the experience of seeing a piece of work and you walked away from it, but you keep thinking about it. It's like haunting you. And hopefully you can go back and get it because we're voracious collectors, so it might be gone. And that happens too. So that's a lesson to be learned. If you see it, you like it, you know it, then you should own that piece.
Well, thank you for that. I forgot to mention, obviously, as you see the images that are being portrayed here, for some of you that may not be as familiar with some of their works, this is an opportunity to see some of the things that our artists have done, and certainly some of what the collectors have collected. So please enjoy that as well. In connection with that last question, and again, this is actually back to the collectors, what was the last piece of art that you purchased and why? Or it can also be an artist as well. I shouldn't just relegate it only to the collectors, because one thing that I've learned is that art collectors are artists sometimes, and artists are definitely collectors. So please feel free to answer.
The last piece of art that I purchased was actually in Cuba, and it was two at a time. One was figurative and one was abstract. And both of them, again, it was just because I walked into the artist studio and the figurative piece was just very striking. It's a picture of a man holding a chicken, but the colors and the composition were what attracted me. And of course the abstract piece, again, it was kind of the color and the form, and like Dee said, the energy that came from the piece, so they weren't local artists.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Dee, I'm going to just call on you. What was the last piece of art that you purchased?
The last piece of art that I purchased was from Pearlie, and it was The Awakening. And she had a sale last summer. Last summer. She had an open studio, and I don't know, I just got a sense that there was a new piece there waiting for me. And I was calling everybody saying, are you going, are you going? And everybody's like, ah. So I wanted to be the first one there, and and I won't lose. Okay? Because I've now drank the Kool-Aid and I'm all in with abstract art now. So this exhibit is just, you know, I'm over the moon about it. And to be able to be here with our organization is just an important moment for us. Because when I got my first piece, seeing both Felicia and Pearlie's work, Pearlie said to me when I bought my first piece, she said, congratulations. And I said, oh, thank you, because I bought the piece. She goes, no, you're evolving. And I kind of pulled back and I said, evolving? What do you mean? Like what? She said, then I realized she was right. I had, you know, moved on from figurative and landscape into the abstract. And so when she had the open studio, I was looking for something that I was going to be able to put in our show that we just finished at the DeSalvo. And so I found that piece there, but the real treasure was your orphan piece. Okay, and apparently there's this beautiful piece, but the framer had messed it up, but I liked it. And so when we came to install it at the house, we sat in the living room and we just enjoyed that piece. And then she was able to appreciate what I saw in the work. And, you know, and that's the connection between the collector and the artist. She said she created and saw it one way, and I received it in another.
Awesome. Well, as many of you noticed, Mr. Parker has just entered the building and sat down with us. Mr. Parker, if you would describe for the people, describing yourself as a collector, what would you want to share with the people as you know, being a collector?
Well, probably that I've been doing it.
If you can pull that a little bit closer, please.
That I've been doing it a long time. Probably close to 50 years.
Wow.
Going back and forth from Chicago to my home in New Jersey and going to New York to see a lot of artists that I met along the way.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you for sharing. So as we continue this discussion, Pearlie, I have a question for you. Your art is amazing. Well, all of your art is amazing. You use a lot of color. What inspires you for your art? Where do you get your inspiration for your art?
No, really, I don't have to be inspired. It took me so many years to get
Come a little closer.
It took me so many years to get to a point where I had time to paint until it was just like a blessing and a gift to be able to get up every day and be able to paint. So I can just stand before a canvas and the first drop of paint takes me to another world because I always paint on the floor. So once I wet the canvas, drop just a bit of paint in there and watch the paint start to spread, that's it for me. I don't have to know anything else because the first color asks for another color and so forth and so on. The painting guides me more than I guide it. I try not to have any kind of ideas about what's going to happen next, and that keeps me free.
That is awesome. So as we're discussing abstract art, I'd like to hear from GL as well as from Felicia. On that note, when we're talking about abstract art, what has, you know, what is your method or your methodology when you're creating the abstract?
So for me, the point of inspiration comes probably through like a rigorous routine of sketching. By the time I get to the canvas or whatever surface I'm working on, I've already pretty much mapped out what I'm going to do. Now there's room for improvisation, but I'm a planner when it comes to how I exercise my creativity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's because I've come from such a strong design background. My approach is a lot of theme and variation, working out visual problems, and I get inspired by everything from architecture, fashion, product design, graphic design, photography. So I see the world as very different, and that impacts these abstract objects.
Awesome, awesome. Felicia, same question.
I was traditionally trained as a child. I drew all the time, and of course in school they teach you drawing, painting, but it's all representational. And the first time I stepped outside from representational work to do a painting for a class, my instructor said, well, you know, that's just palette knife painting. So he really put it down. So I went back to the traditional way of painting. And as I started showing my work years later, I was still doing a lot of representational work. Then a friend came by my house and saw a piece of non-representational work and said, oh, this is really nice. Why don't you do that? And I told him about the story that, you know, from the instructor. And he says, well, but you're not in school anymore. So I began to really work with non-representational work. It started years ago working. I found that I really liked texture, and I started working with plaster, doing larger pieces using plaster. And after it took some years to kind of refine it so that it will stay on the canvas. But I found myself always drawn to the same colors and the same palette. And the first time I went to, I don't remember whether it was Jamaica or the Bahamas, and saw a wonderful sunset, I knew instinctively that's what it was. It was my love of sunrises and sunsets. You know, that sense of feeling this, and you feel like you're so in the presence of God in that moment. And that's what I was always trying to achieve. Sometimes I would do representational works that are, or sometimes they make it a little abstract, that are sunrise and sunsets. But most of my work, you see the sunrise and the sunset. And sometimes for a long time, I don't think people really got it. I had somebody say to me one time, she came across the room, there was a show, a lot of people there, she came straight across to my work. But she didn't understand. She said, what are you trying to say? I don't understand. What is it supposed to mean? And I said, when you walked across the room and it pulled you over there, that's what it does. It's visceral. You feel it. It doesn't have to tell you a story. You create your own story based on what you see. And people are always telling me what they see in my work. Oh, I see this and I see that. It is instinctive because we're always creatively thinking. We look at clouds and we see imagery. We look at cracks on the sidewalk and we see imagery. So we're always creating. This is just another way of looking at a piece of work and creating your own story that you bring back into the work.
Thank you.
I like to smile on that a little bit. And it's pretty much the same.
Come a little bit closer to your mic. We want to hear these amazing words you use.
Okay. When I started going to school for art, I was full-grown adult. My children were teenagers by then. But because I had been drawing almost my entire life, I dabbled in a little bit of everything. So by the time I got to class, I discovered along the way, maybe a couple years down the road, that I had already established ideas in my head. So it was like I knew what I wanted to do, even though I was figurative at the time. The work I was doing was becoming a little looser over the years. And at that time, I wouldn't have known how to begin an abstract. That didn't happen until later down the road. But what the schooling did for me was give me perspective and legitimize the fact that I was a true artist, because I never heard it until then. So, you know, art is, as she says, exactly what the viewer sees it to be. Not so much as it is what I say it is.
Right. Awesome. As a follow-up to that, and I'm speaking to the artist now, and Jill, I'd like you to answer first. Are you ever surprised in what you create, and you may have a certain thought about what it is, but then when you hear people's responses to it, what is that like?
Are you referring to me being surprised by the response?
Yes, because you may have a particular theme about your piece, but for whatever reason, they're not responding to that. They're responding in a totally different way.
No, I'm definitely open to allowing the viewer to have their own interpretation of my work. At that point, I just kind of release it to the world, and I have had some surprising comments, though. One in particular that has haunted me for a long time. It's probably because of my ego. But this woman said that she saw one of my pieces. She said that would terrify children. That was one. And then I occasionally will get my son can do that or whatever. And part of me takes that as a compliment. I enjoy being in an almost childlike state of creativity. Like Pearlie mentioned, there's a certain sense of freedom that comes with working in abstract. Although we have very different approaches, that sense of freedom is what keeps me pursuing this as a career. And if anyone knows my lifestyle, as far as freedom is concerned, it's no wonder that I work in abstraction. You know, I still like riding skateboards and doing wheelies on bicycles, drag racing, fast cars, and stuff like that. So that, I'm getting off subject a little bit.
It's fun.
But yes, occasionally I am surprised. But in general, I welcome that conversation. Someone sees something differently than I do.
Does that inform, and again, I want to give time to the other artists to answer, but when you hear those responses, and maybe you're doing a series or have you ever done a series? So when you hear that response, does that somehow inform how you continue in the series when you hear those responses, or you just totally just throw that out?
I wouldn't say I totally threw it out. I think that all of life's experiences affect your work, even those interactions that you wouldn't otherwise expect.
Sure.
That's going to be the short version. Yeah, because I could probably ramble on about that particular.
Certainly. So either Pearlie or Felicia, if you wanted to respond to that as well.
What I find very interesting is that sometimes people come back to me after years and tell me about a piece of work. And I have been very prolific. So I may not necessarily remember the piece or remember the title. Sometimes I do, other times I don't. But I find enjoyment out of hearing them describe it to me. And my first question to them is that, do you still love it? Do you still like it? And I get usually an overwhelming response that they do, which feels really good. And what I find important about that too is that when I am creating, there is a sense of joy when I'm creating. And it feels like I am able to translate this sense of joy over to someone else. And also as a collector, I tell people, going back to one of the questions that was asked before, what makes you decide on a piece of work? Why would you purchase? I find that often when people collect, sometimes there's a group of collectors that collect because they think the person's work might be valuable later on. And then there's a group that you're just moved by the work itself. And what I tell people often, if you purchase work that you love, you can't lose because you'll always love it. And if the artist's work increases in value, then that's a bonus if you love it. And I say, think about this. If you believe that we are all made of energy, that there's energy all over the universe, and artists are putting that passionate energy into their work. And behind it is passion, love, and all of that. And all of that is emanating from your walls. If you notice, if you're a collector, there is a sense of peace that you have in your home because you have all of this wonderful, loving, passionate energy emanating from your walls. And it does make a difference, and people do feel it when they come in your space.
I think all of us will concur with that. Thank you for sharing that. Y'all can clap on that if y'all want to. So this question is more to our collectors, and that would be, why is abstract art important to you? I'm going to begin with you. I'll begin with James, if that's okay.
Who am I?
Pull mic down.
Thanks. Well, I should tell you the genesis of my collecting. It started probably when I was about 6 or 7 years old. My mom worked for a doctor who gave her a Rembrandt print. I don't know what edition, what it was. But anyway, sadly, father took it to a pawn shop, and we tried to follow up, but there was no print to be found. I had a major in art, and possibly that could have been a part of the reason. But more importantly, I found a relationship with artists. And it was during that time that I was in college at Hampton. And it was, we had the banjo lesson, which was a standard that was in the university. It was instituted when I went there. And I was an architect major for 2 years, and then switched over to art. But during that process, I got to meet a lot of people who were actually practicing art and who were professionals, and met them and liked their work. They in turn would give a piece to me. But it was in New York that I met Bob Blackburn, who was a major printmaker in New York City. And when I'd go home, I'd always go to the printmaker's workshop. And this is probably something that I should say, that abstract art is not restricted to just paintings, sculpture, as you see the one by Mel Edwards on the floor. But Bob was a master printer, and he would help artists who were painters but were not printmakers. And the master printer helps the artists make their work into edition through the medium of printmaking. It can be woodcut, vinyl, lithograph. But anyway, he was an expert and invited many artists who couldn't afford to come to the printmaker's workshop. And that's where it started. And I started collecting prints when I was in Japan. I taught in Yokosuka, Japan, after I had worked in Gary, Indiana for about 4 years. And there I met printmakers who were working in abstract mold. I don't know if you've talked about abstraction, but there's a long history of it. And the people that I met were mostly involved with abstractions, particularly the Japanese. But when I came back to stateside in Chicago, I found that there were very few people practicing that. So there goes the Japanese collection. But I met living treasures. These were living artists who were recognized by the Japanese government to be living treasures. And I met people from the free speech movement who took me to a plotter who was a living treasure. And when I came back to the Midwest, I said, there must be living treasures here, unknown. And so I started looking, and sure enough, there were many people who had gone to the School of the Art Institute and were working in abstraction, basically figurative. But of course, that was superseded by the figurative artists who were here. And I think the Art Institute was probably the premier art school, but many artists came here and left because they found that it was more advantageous because there were more galleries, more museums, and the opportunity for hopefully creating a life for themselves as artists.
Thank you for that very brief answer. No, I'm just joking. I wanted to have the opportunity, and again, thank you very much. I want to have the opportunity for the other collectors to answer that as well, as to why abstract art is important to you. D.E.
Well, I'm new to it, so the importance of it for me is that I've seen it all along my journey as a collector, but I didn't get it. You know, I would look at it and kind of like the comments you were getting, like, oh, I could do that. You know, but then, you know, you really can't. And I think, you know, Pearlie was on point when she said I had evolved, because when you're ready to learn something, a teacher comes. You know, you're ready to expand your portfolio, your collection, I believe the artist comes. You know, and so I've seen, you know, their works, and now I see it in a different way. You know, because I mean, I've been trying to add GL to my collection, and we met a couple of times and tried to find, well, what piece is going to work with what's already in my house. And so when we talk about abstract does not distract, it's like, well, how to fit it in. And so when I started moving in this direction and I got the pieces up, they played well together. So when I was thinking about the integration of the works into my collection, I was overthinking it. You know, as opposed to just sticking with the basic format that we were given, you know, as an organization. Buy what you like, bring it home. The art will tell you where it's supposed to be.
There you go.
I'm really glad to hear that DE is moving towards abstraction.
Especially the ones in your house.
Yeah, I want to give you the opportunity to answer that.
I want to answer the question,
Why is abstract art important to you?
Actually, abstract was my first love, first of all, and secondly, because I'm not necessarily a creative person myself. Abstract allows, that's my creation, because like Felicia was saying, I can pull a story out of a piece of art, just because it lends itself to that. The artist hasn't told us what to think about the piece. I get to tell my own story with it. And interestingly, I have a number of pieces that from time to time have changed their position. The artist may have created the piece vertically and I hang it horizontally. That's my creativity, because I see it hanging that way. I see the story coming out of it that way. But I think that's why it's important to me, because it does allow me that flexibility and creativity.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I want to backtrack for a moment because I didn't have the opportunity for the artists to answer the other two, for Pearlie and Felicia to answer. Have they ever been surprised by people's responses to their art? So I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak to that. Pearlie, you can start.
Yes, I have. I've been told that there's children who do that. Because the person told they don't see anything in the work, they don't see any value in the work, and because they don't understand the work, they pass that on to whoever else is, they try to pass it on to whoever else is listening. But they would be hard pressed to get their kid to come up with a piece like that, or to even try it themselves. Because most abstract work is made up of a lot of layers
Yes.
over time. And it takes a while for us to see something that will allow us to let it go at that point. I created a piece once where, to finish up the piece, I just picked up a handful of paint and I threw it at the paint. For me, that was just pure joy. But one of the statements I received about the piece, now the piece ended up being very popular, I didn't have it very long, was that they didn't understand why I would mess up that painting with that art, with that paint that I threw in the center. But that paint in the center, to me, absolutely just brought it alive. So having somebody tell me that their kids can do it, it really doesn't bother me at all. What it does is open the conversation about the piece. And as long as you can talk about art or open a discussion about art, they don't have to like it. It's good. Art needs to be discussed and debated, you know.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
I actually did answer the question, but I have something else to say about it because something came up when Pearlie was talking. I did a show one time where there were, multiple artists in the room, and there was a family that was coming by, and the younger daughter from the family, they walked past, and she said, "Oh, that's just paint." Because obviously they did not understand it. But one of the things that I recognize as a teacher, because for many years, a lot of people did not like, my work would get passed over a lot because it was non-representational or abstract. And so I kind of was trying to combine representational imagery along with the color in a different way to get people's attention. And I finally said, no, I just have to do what pleases me. But during that time, I was working with high school students, and we were working on a large mural. And I had them to draw images, because it was a multicultural school, images of different people of different cultures into the work. Now I could teach them to draw. And then I textured the background, and I was going to do the background in color. So I put texture on boards and let them play around with it. And what they did was create mud, what I call mud. Either they were getting grays or browns. And that's when I really realized that it does, most people think it comes easily. It doesn't come that easily. You have to have a certain affinity for how you mix the paint in order to get it not to turn into mud, like I said, what I consider a brown or a gray, and that's what they were getting. So in the long run, I ended up having to do the background myself because they just couldn't do it.
Thank you, thank you. I want to backtrack for just a moment to Pearlie's answer when you said, when you hear people saying, for all of you that said, when people say, well, my kid can do that. And you made a statement, they would be hard pressed to repeat the type of work that you do, and I would totally agree, and I'm sure everyone in this room would agree. When you hear those types of statements though, does it motivate you to do even more work? Or, and again, I know you mentioned that it creates a conversation, but does it motivate you in other ways in terms of when you're creating art?
No.
Well, there you have it.
That's because I have an obligation to do what I do. And I already know that everyone is not going, it's just not for everyone. So I'd rather focus on the people who will enjoy it, get something from it, or who want to engage me with conversation about the piece. So the ones who don't get it, they just don't get it, and it's okay.
There you go.
But they get it eventually.
Yes, they do get it.
Did you want to speak to that?
Well, I often think about abstract art in the sense of, it's like it can be, not in all cases, but an acquired taste. It does take, at least for me, it took a lot of learning, experimenting, and growth, developing like a visual palette to kind of understand and allow yourself to be sensitive to more conceptual work. It's like any other thing. The more you exercise a certain muscle, it strengthens. And so, from a visual perspective, and even, I guess, intellectually, because some abstract work can be highly conceptual, and you just kind of have to really be open-minded, train your mind and your mind's eye to be receptive to certain aesthetics.
Yes, yes. Thank you, thank you. My next question again, I want to speak to the artist, but again, you may be able to, as collectors, speak to this as well, but what has been your greatest failure in your art that has proven to be actually a tremendous success?
My greatest failure. Oh, let's see. My greatest success.
What that has proven to become one of your greater successes?
The fact that, for the longest, like I was saying a few minutes ago, that I tended to lean more toward representational because I was responding to what I felt like other people wanted. And then I had a comment once before, because my work often changes, that it was very immature because of that. But instead of allowing that to have a negative impact on my work, I just decided to claim it, because when I create something, I don't think about what I did the last time and say, oh, well, I did that before, or this is not like what I did before, so just push it to the side. Because I feel like the energy that works through me, it's not like I can say, no, that wasn't last week's work, or that wasn't last month's work, so don't do it. I am very experimental with my work because I have allowed it to come through me, and I just put out what comes through me. And I think that in some ways, people can find, like, they may have a series that they like, because I do work in series, like if I'm working on a movie or work, it will have similar qualities in it. And then once I move on, something may be slightly different. And so I don't have a problem with that. It seems like sometimes other people may move toward one thing or the other. And sometimes I put some representational imagery in it, but often that may come from a theme, because I'm working through a thing that somebody else has in the show, as opposed to just what's coming through me. But I just kind of allow it to ruminate, the idea to ruminate and come out to be what it was. And I find that, for me, has been very successful, because I'm not dictated by what other people think or feel. I just feel what I feel and put it out there, and you feel it or not, and I'm comfortable with that.
Thank you.
Now, this may sound a little lame, but I don't have failures.
Okay.
My mind tells me that wherever that paint hit that canvas, it's right. And I've always felt that way. That was where it was supposed to go. It's right. So that's just where I am with that. And it could be because it took me, well, I've only been painting professionally about 20 years. So because it took me so long, and it's just my life now, and I'm at the point where I love painting, I love for people to like my work, but I got to do this anyway. So that's just the way I feel about that. Wherever that paint hits that canvas, it's right. Now, my greatest successes has turned out to be what I use bronze paint, which is what I'm doing currently. I like using different objects to see how the paint is going to move on that canvas, or how it's going to, what kind of mark it's going to make, and so forth. I use a little bit of everything. I bought a bathroom brush once just to see what happened with that form on the canvas.
Sure.
Well, when I started using the broom on the canvas, I had the broom standing there, I had the mop, I had a dustpan, I had all sorts of things. And I wanted to see what kind of marks they would make on the canvas. Well, it turns out I used the broom. And that is the process that only allows me 2 sweeps. And it's done, and it requires a lot of paint. So once I make that, I'm like a wild person when I do it, and I paint the music all the time because that gives me the motion. That first sweep, I can do that maybe in about, I'll study the canvas, maybe 10 minutes. And what it does, once I pick it up off the canvas, paint drips from it. And I use that to do other things, create more drama. Now that second sweep, I may have to take a break, go have a sandwich, approach it just like I'm shooting pool with the broom, and whatever angle I do, I use maybe another stick to get an angle to make practice sweeps, because when I do that second sweep, that's it. So once I finally do that second sweep and use whatever's falling from that creates the drama, it's over. I can't touch it again. That has been a very successful project for me, and series, because I've done it in series. And one of the paintings GE is talking about is one that I use that motion to. So,
Thank you.
That's an interesting question. I can't say that I have an actual, something that I feel is a failure, because the work that we all do as artists, to me, is so intentional. And there's no really room for judgment in that capacity. I do think that there's room for critique, but that's very different than something as subjective as
Yes.
success and failure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I was spinning it more in terms of, have you created something that maybe you thought, I know it's very intentional, that maybe you said, well, I might have done it this way or that way, but then when people's responses to it, it seems like, oh, well, that worked out.
Well, I have had pieces that I've revisited over the course of years, but it wasn't necessarily based on other people's response. I think it was more so, it's my piece. I can work on it for many years if I choose. But again, the success, failure aspect to me is, there's so much room for opinion in that regard.
Certainly. Well, I knew that was a loaded question when I asked it, so, sure, certainly.
I have purchased works from artists where the piece was, say, in the back of the pile. Because the artist decided it didn't turn out the way they wanted it to. They weren't particularly happy with it. And I loved it, so I purchased it. I've taken it home, I framed it, and put it on the wall, and the artist saw it later and said, I never saw it that way. So it's just a matter of how they're looking at the work at the time. And I wouldn't necessarily call that a failure, it's just that it didn't turn out the way they wanted it to.
Certainly. Thank you for sharing that. This question, what do you consider habits to help or hinder your creativity? And again, that's an open question to any of the artists.
For me, as far as habits, I meditate. Most of my creativity stems from, it's like an extension of spirituality. And that doesn't necessarily show in the piece, but as far as the practice, that level of, it's almost like a ritual. Like early paints and music. I paint music as well, but it's typically very Zen-like. My studio practice is extremely orderly, burning incense, candle. And that probably shows in my work in certain ways. Even some of the pieces that appear to be loose, they're still quite calculated. That's just the way I'm wired. Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know if I have any particular habits, but I do listen to music a lot because I was married to musicians, so therefore music played all the time. Only 2 marriages though. I said it just happened that they were good musicians. So I've been listening a long time, and I like a little bit of everything. So that's pretty much the only constant that I have when I paint. Otherwise, I can paint sometimes, but nothing, just here's that.
Thank you.
Like GL, I meditate and pray before I work. I have an altar in my studio, so that's my usual practice. Now, whatever series I'm working on, it may not necessarily be the same, but one of the things that I recognize, I've always felt that there is an energy that works through me. And when it was confirmed for me, my studio is in the basement of my home. And when it was confirmed for me, I was working on a piece for a show. Some of you are familiar with Sapphire and Crystals. And it just wasn't happening for me. I didn't know where it was going or what to do with it. But and it was a larger piece of work, and I was trying to get it ready for this show. So I work most of the time in the middle of the night. So it was about 4 o'clock in the morning. I didn't know where the piece was going. So I left the studio, turned off the light in the studio, and went to turn off another light in the basement. And it was just like that. Immediately, and I was physically tired. Immediately, I was no longer physically tired, and in my head, I knew exactly what to do to complete the piece. And I went back to the studio, and I worked for another 2 hours. And at the time, my husband is deceased, but at the time, I went upstairs, I'm jumping around in the bed because I'm so excited because I had been struggling over this piece. And that was what confirmed to me that it is an energy that works through me, because to no longer be physically tired, and in an instant, it was like one light went off and another light came on. And I knew that it was not me. I can say, some of you old school people know what that means. Yeah, I got it like that. But it was my confirmation that I am allowing an energy to come and work through me and put the work out. I am just the vessel by which it uses. And I'm grateful for that because I love what I do. And the piece was called Zora's Fire, inspired by Zora Neale Hurston, and it is one of the pieces that I have in the Paul Jones collection.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. So I want to pose this question to our collectors. And so let me preface by saying, right now, art, particularly African-American art, is very popular right now. And with that in mind, are you ever tempted as a collector to purchase art that you believe that will have, more monetary value in the coming future? Does that ever inform your purchase decisions as collectors? Certainly.
No.
No.
Well, I speak to object. Because it does. In many instances, you are expending your money for a work that you love, but also that you hope will increase in value.
Okay, so that would be a yes.
Yes.
Okay,
Can I go back to the habit thing?
sure, go ahead.
As a collector, the new habit that I've developed is one of continuing to learn. And by my doing that, it has brought this day forward. As executive director of Diasporisms, worked with the executive director of the ARTSmart Museum, and when Hallie said she was going to bring an all African-American abstract artist show to Chicago, I said, you gotta make sure you include the local artist. And so from that, we had the brainchild to have the exhibition programming to be an ARTSmart and to feature a local artist here. And as a result of that, look at all this fabulous art in this exhibition and all the work that we're featuring in the PowerPoint. So the habit I would encourage, the new collectors and the current collectors is to keep seeking out the abstract artists, because there's a lot to learn.
Thank you for sharing that. Did you have something you wanted to share?
I want to answer that question as a collector as well.
What's the question about your decisions on your purchase decision?
Right.
Okay.
Just based on what I love, if the work is more expensive, sometimes, I do layaways, I do trade. When I see something, it's like being an artist and doing a lot of shows. You're like a kid in a candy store, and you want what you see. And so a lot of that has just been a desire to have something that I love, that I have been drawn to, and not necessarily monetarily. But sometimes because of monetary things, I miss some things and sorry that I did.
Thank you for sharing. I'd like to take a few moments at this time to open it up to our audience. If there's a question that you may have for either our collectors or artists, so please feel free. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question to James Parker. He said he's been collecting abstract art for about 50 plus years or so.
Yes.
So that means that you were collecting basically at the time that the people that we're seeing work on the wall.
Exactly.
All right, so you're familiar with their work and more than likely know them. How do you compare the abstract art that existed during that time, like say 20, 30, 40 years ago, compared to what's being produced today?
Well, it's changed in many ways. In the sense that more people have been seeing their work. When I started collecting, there were few people who were buying the work by African-American artists or American artists. And of course, art is a whole body of study, of work. And the artists have their own mindset. They bring to the arena creativity that grows. I remember we were talking about using the broom. Yeah, well, that was Ed Clark, who I knew and still know, and he was using that. It was his innovation. He had gone to Paris, as many of the artists did, because this was during the 40s and after the war. He had studied in the Art Institute. But yes, the work grows. And Sam, who I met while he was showing in Chicago, in fact, many of the artists here, and that was why I was drawn to this conversation. Many of the artists on view I knew, and I had to work by them. It's minor if I compare it to people. However, there was a big pull about the history, and that was what I was trying to bring to the table. There were many people who felt that art, if it was not a figurative or something that had a black figure in it, they wouldn't buy it. Because they said, and this goes back to the old idea that we wanted black art. And of course, many artists rejected that idea because they wanted to be seen as an artist, not based upon the color of their skin. And of course, it goes back to segregation. They had no outlet in many instances, no galleries. Only those who had gone to historically black institutions, there might have been an artist there. So coming back to Chicago, and I do that often, means that here in Chicago, which is very segregated, though the school was not, there was a renewed interest in the figure. And basically, when I saw things in the collections of African American collectors, it primarily was something with the figure. So it's good to see abstract art in the collection of people here.
Thank you. Thank you. You have another question? Go ahead.
Hi, I have a question. Is this on?
Yep.
Okay. My question is for GL. GL, Regina and I are fortunate enough to have one of your ceramic plates. And the question is, why did you stop producing them? And do you tend to go back to them?
Why did I stop? Those were a lot of, I've got a lot of pleasure out of creating those. It wasn't meant to be an ongoing series. I probably did a total of maybe 30 or 40 of those pieces. I would be open to revisiting that. I think that the style in which I'm working in right now doesn't translate on that surface for me. But I appreciate it. And it's something that, you know, I'm open to it. I'm open. But it's not necessarily part of my plan right now. You know, but I mean, I would be open to revisiting that.
Thank you. Any other question?
Yes, we are a collectors group, and while I think many, if not all of us, would agree that the artist's creativity and the collector's response to it is the most important thing, there is still this issue that the art is not being passed around for free. So my question to the artist is, how do you value your art? How do you price it? And my question to the collectors is, how do you determine if you want to pay the price that's listed on the art?
Great question.
I have to eat. So, in all seriousness, that's one of the most asked questions is that, particularly starting out as an artist. I've been doing art now for 26 years professionally, and there's so many factors that play into pricing that go beyond time, cost of materials. There are life experiences, there are things that add to your, I guess, resume, where your work has been shown, who's handled your work. Other collectors, what they've paid for comparable pieces. So the market, it's a little bit of an educated guess. The market sort of dictates those price points. And I've always been moderately flexible, more so with how you pay, not so much the actual, the value of the piece though. And that's been my approach.
Well, it's their life's work. People who have jobs, you expect a salary. The artist, he's creating or she's creating a body of work that they spent their lives doing, and it's their livelihood. So I always think about myself that you wouldn't want to pay someone and then try to get them to go lower if you were working for them. The same thing happens for an artist. She or he has put a great deal of time and his life and energy into creating something new, something different, something that most ordinary people don't do. So their lives are pretty unconventional, and they depend upon you as a supporter to be able to maintain that lifestyle of creativity.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to answer that question?
I agree totally with GL and
Could you repeat that question?
I say that I agree totally with GL and with Mr. Harvey.
Do we have any more? I'm so sorry. Oh, go ahead, please.
I try to make my work as much as possible available to people. If I find somebody who really loves a piece of work, I will try to bring it down some in order to accommodate them. Because I look at it this way, I've been very prolific over the years. I've been working for over 30 years. And I've been very prolific. And when I do a show, if it doesn't sell, it goes back into a room and I'm back working again. And so when people approach me, you know, it depends on what it is, how large it is, because the larger work I will not, you know, come back on. Some of the larger works that I do with plaster and paper pulp that may take me months or even years to complete, where I'm doing other small work, I'm not likely to come down on those, but other things I will, because I feel like if I just have them in a room, they're not being out there to be enjoyed. So I try to make it within reason available to people if I can.
Awesome. Do we have any other question? We have time for maybe.
Yes, I'd like to ask the artists, who are your heroes or sheroes that have inspired you that might be abstract artists, and are any of their works here, and how have they inspired you to build upon their work?
Take your time.
When I first started out, it was, you know, when I was an undergrad, you know, of course, there were only European artists that were being, that we were seeing. And so Jackson Pollock became someone whose work I was interested in. As more books started coming out of African American artists, because there was a long time before I actually got a chance to see the work of African American artists. I didn't know about the Southside Community Arts Center when I was young. And so as books started coming out, I love the work of Sam Gilliam, Romare Bearden, some are not coming out right now. She was Alma Thomas, who did not start working until after she retired as a school teacher. So, and some I can't think of right now, so I won't hold you up there.
Yeah, those are mine as well. But I think Jackson Pollock's work was the first abstract work I saw that really moved me. And I followed and looked at everything, every book that I could find that had his work. But also, Sam Gilliam is one of my all-time favorites. Ed Clark is mentioned. I like his work. I think he works mostly in oil. I was inspired by the freedom in his strokes. And I'm big on being free to do however way I want. And I don't try to imitate anybody, but I do try to use as many different objects as I can to do what I do. Also, I like Dale Chihuly. And I like him for the colors that he used. And I'm all about color. So, the way he uses color, a lot of them are untraditional colors that you don't normally put together. And if I want to come up with some different colors to use in my larger paintings, 9 times out of 10, I'll look at his work. And I'll kind of know which way I want to go with choosing the colors that I intend to use.
I've just been jotting down a few names. Mark Rothko is probably one of my all-time favorite artists. Keith Haring. And there are a host of street artists that I like to go by various graffiti tags that I can't. Miro, Picasso, and Willem de Kooning is also another artist that I admire. And the interesting thing about a lot of this work is very loose and free, and it's completely opposite from the way that I work. And I think that's why I admire your work so much. Is that sense, that lyricism, your strokes. I can tell you're having a blast in the studio just by looking at your work. Whereas I enjoy what I do, but it's a different type of freedom under very controlled circumstances. That's just kind of.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
All right, go right in.
When I view abstract art, many times I find the titles of the work to be equally as powerful as the works themselves. And I'm wondering a little bit about your process as artists. How do you decide what you're going to title a piece and or why some pieces remain untitled?
Oh, that's a great question. I should have asked that question.
90% of my work is untitled, so I'm going to like these others. But why? For me, it's more of allowing people to receive the work how they want to receive it, as opposed to leading them or misleading them, for that matter. It makes the viewer part of that process. And some collectors will title pieces that have been untitled, and I welcome that sometimes.
Wow. I hate to title my book, but I do it anyway because I find that people need a book. They need a way to think. People need a hook, and they need a way to think about how to view the work. And sometimes not giving it a title, they don't know if they're not familiar with abstract work, they don't know how to feel about it or how to think. So for that reason, I will title it. I do like ambiguous titles, and they can figure it out from there. But a lot of my work is very personal to me, and sometimes when I finish a piece, it says something about me. And one of the pieces, I think you've probably seen it flashed across there, is called Fear of Flying. And it was about emotions, how I felt during my first plane flight. And all of that was in that piece. You know, it was like screaming, you know. So sometimes the title will be right there when you finish the piece. Other times, it's just hard to think of a title for a piece.
I rarely ever have work that is untitled. Most of my titles come from maybe whatever life experience I'm going through. And again, because I work a lot intuitively, sometimes I walk past a piece and a title just pops up in my head. Well, I have to write it down because an hour later I may not remember it. So sometimes I feel like these just title themselves. More often than not, that's what happens. Something quickly comes in my head, and that's what I go with. And if I don't write it down, it's like, oh, okay, I lost that one. You got to tell me again.
All right, well, we have time for one last question.
Yes, I have a question in regards to color field painting. You mentioned Rocco and Gilliam, both of who kind of come from that school. You said you like them, but does that mean that you have been influenced by color field painting or a variety of types of painting?
I definitely have been influenced by color field paintings, and it shows in a small body of work that I revisit from time to time that are very minimalist, geometric, and I guess they stem from a sort of a spiritual experience, and I think that is comparable to a lot of Rothko's work. Two different techniques, but same sort of foundations, I suppose.
You're talking about two examples from different places. You know, the color field people, mostly they were in Washington, D.C. and had a great influence upon Sam. Whereas Ed talks about the influence that he had while in Paris and living in Joan Mitchell's studio. And the influence through his travels, he's very into color. And wherever he goes, he's influenced by the color. And I was trying to think of somebody else here. I get a feeling that, and I did meet him at the Witherspoon Gallery, the artist who did the black, that he's truly influenced by probably Louise Nevelson, although he talks about growing up in Connecticut. And, but anyway, there's a whole history, and I do a lot of reading, which kind of informs my thinking about art a great deal. And I always tell people to read and find out more about the artists if possible. So it's wonderful to have a monograph on most of these artists here. There have been publications about them. Their works have been shown in museums and places around the world. So they have broadened the knowledge of what Black artists have done internationally and locally. You start out locally, but you hope that your work will go to other arenas, to other places, because you have people here, and collectors are not a dime a dozen. Those are people who spend a great deal of their time and money trying to get works of the highest quality.
Okay, thank you so much. Oh, okay, well, this is the last question. It better be good.
Greetings, panel. Thank you for, my name is Angelica Moore. Thank you as the very last question. Thank you for your contributions to African American art and abstract art. My question is, as a emerging artist, if you will, how should young African American artists who tend to utilize social media connect that to the traditional routes of being found from collectors? Thank you.
Good question. Thank you.
Excuse me, what was the last part of what you said? We didn't quite get that.
I said, how should emerging and this generation of artists connect to from social media to a more traditional route being found by collectors?
Just trying to get the work out there, which sometimes gets to be very difficult. I try to enter shows that I can find online. I try to make connections with other people so that when there's something coming up, people that are familiar with me and familiar with my work will say, hey, you know, there's this show or that show. So just trying to visit galleries, trying to connect with people, trying to get the work out there so it's seen. Well, social media, I think is good. That's not my best forte. However, just trying to meet people so you can get the work hung out there so people can physically see the work.
There is no easy route to that. You just have to do the work, try to exhibit in as many shows as you can, and just keep doing what you do and not be focused so much on, well, maybe I shouldn't say this, but at first I wasn't focused so much on selling the work as I was on trying to create good work that I thought people would enjoy collecting. But it's just not easy. Just continue to work and put it out there. You know, go to shows and same as, you know, what Felicia just did.
I think the social media component is just that, another component. The pathway will still be the same. You have to be shown, we have to go to the galleries, and if we encounter your work and we don't know you, one of the things we'll do is we're going to go to social media and then look you up and see what you have on display. So both avenues will work to benefit you getting visibility and benefit us as collectors and being able to know who you are and get familiar with your work.
Anybody else want to say anything?
The traditional route has usually been the curators who write, who've seen bodies of work and feel that your work would fit into a particular arena that they are working on. And often, we don't have those connections. And that's really important. Luckily, there's a call for more curators of African descent. And that's very important because they hold a great deal of power about what is seen in museums, what is seen in shows. And there are a lot of scholarships for younger artists through Pollock Foundation. Many artists have left money to cultivate future artists. And I think that's very admirable. But they are the ones who are seen by curators. Curators are very, very important to the growth of an artist. So are dealers. Without a dealer, and I often say this, and of course I get pounded, because they are in the business, and art has become a business. And people invest in it, not for the fun of it, but for the continuation of the creative process.
I didn't hear all of your question. Was it specifically about social media? If not, as a collector, one of my favorite outlets for viewing art is open studios and studio visits. That's my preference.
All right.
Excuse me. Ladies and gentlemen, I keep seeing his hand pop up every time. You know, I hardly to say so. He's been trying to get that question.
All right, you are the last question. Thank you for this.
Persistence. As an artist, I'm always interested in social context and my own origin. How does environment and social context today influence your work, or are you just in a peaceful place where you're just intuitive and that is another plan? Do you feel responsible? Or do you feel that that's just something that doesn't necessarily happen with your work? Is social context or is environment part of why you do what you do? Or has it ever touched you or caused you to think about it when you produce things?
Okay, so I'll answer that. Yeah, there are different things. Like I said, I have a way of working, a general way that I work most of the time. But when there's something that comes up socially that touches me, it does get back into the work. The Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter. So it may come up in a certain series during the course of my regular working. So yes, that happens. Like I said, there's me that just does what comes through, and there's me that is touched and affected by the other things that are going on in the world.
My approach tends to shy away from like social activism. I curate just a very visually, I guess my attempt is just creating good looking work. Certain aesthetic trends affect my work for sure, but as far as communicating social issues, things of that nature, not so much for me.
I also stay away from social issues, but sometimes I will translate how I feel about the issue, and it will come out probably in certain colors that I use in my palette. I recently did a piece called The Death of Justice. It was an abstract piece, but you could definitely see where I was going by the way it was titled. But other than that, I pretty much stay away from social issues.
Well, thank you. Thank you so very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to say thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you for taking your time and sharing your wisdom and talking about your art, your collection. So thank you again.